Right.
So, hello, my name is Ken Coates. I'm a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and have been the director of the Institute's now long-standing program on Indigenous people and the natural resource economy. I'm here today with Sheldon Wuttunee, who is the president and chief executive officer of the Saskatchewan First Nations Natural Resource Center of Excellence. Those of us in Saskatchewan know him as one of the most thoughtful leaders, Indigenous or non-Indigenous leaders, in the whole field of sort of oil and gas development. A man with incredible roots in his community. He's from Red Pheasant Cree First Nation. He served as a chief for 2 terms. Has been involved with the Battleford Agency Tribal Council, tribal chiefs, and has a wonderful background as an educator, activist, community leader, and very, very heavily involved in the oil and gas sector. So, Sheldon, thank you very much for being with us today.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you very much for having me, Ken. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you today.
Yeah, you and I have talked about some of these issues before, and I'm very impressed with your perspective. So, maybe just on a personal note, how and when did you get involved in the oil and gas sector in a significant way?
Yeah, well, early on, I think in my tenure as chief of our First Nation out in Red Pheasant, we had existing gas wells up in the Pierceland Loon Lake area. We had treaty land entitlement um, uh, lands that were chosen for that purpose, and so that really started my familiarity in the oil and gas sector. In terms of understanding agreements and what they mean to us as First Nations, and really looking at the not only the economic side of things, but learning a little bit more about the potential environmental impacts that go along with oil and gas development. And through that exercise, certainly became more keenly aware of a project that had come through back in 2000, 2007, 2008, and a bit forward from there with the Enbridge Alberta Clipper pipeline. And with respect to that, I'd always been a big believer, of course, in inherent and treaty rights, and continue today. And really, starting to understand different perspectives around natural resource transfer agreement, and into how we experience or interact with resource development, in today's world. And I've always been very close to our elders and our culture. I've been very fortunate to grow up and have teachers today in our traditional aspects of life, and relating that to aspects of inherent rights and treaty, the development of the NRTA, and into what occurs today. And really, one of those teachings that we've been what has been impressed upon us by our elders, is around the 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 myth around ceding and surrendering our resources. And it's something that continues right across the globe today. Issues around this, around rights to resources, and who has rights, and the complications and complex conversations that arise from that. So when the Alberta Clipper came through, it was for me an opportunity to become a little bit more heavily involved. Of course, we spent some time as intervener in the pipeline, getting more familiar with the National Energy Board processes. Along that time as well, we had developed the Battleford Agency Tribal Chiefs Tribal Council. So it became an aspect of us initially getting involved in this pipeline process, and then that grew from Red Pheasant included other bands as well, Moosomin and Sweetgrass, and others that were involved in the tribal council. So that's really at the outset is really to look at ensuring that we participate in a meaningful and respectful way in terms of resource development. So I might get into that a little deeper, but just in terms of your question specifically, that really got me going and barking on on my interest and involvement in the oil and gas pipeline in the resource sector, respectively.
So one thing, look, I got 1,000 questions, Sheldon. This is so interesting. Yeah. But one of the things that always stands out is how respectful you are in your relationships with government and oil and gas companies. That you're very strong. You're a very strong advocate for the things that you believe in. But you seem to get away from sort of confrontation. Explain to me your sort of philosophy, your approach to the oil and gas sector.
Yeah, well, I think early on, I'll kind of go back a little bit, to that time, to my time as chief, and I've always been a big believer of, putting your money where your mouth is and making sure that we're able to do our homework when we come to the table. Obviously, along with resource projects, there's a lot of planning, safety, pre-operational, operational aspects, a lot of the technical aspects. But from our First Nations perspective, there's a considerable amount of education as well that needs to occur around our elders' teachings and our ties to the land, and how do we bring that forward where it may not be a clash, but how do we start to develop that respect so that those meaningful conversations can occur. And I mean, back in the Clipper days, we had landed and I guess put forward some faith in an agreement where we would come together and start to look at opportunities, whether it's work or contracts or resource revenue sharing, that whole equity piece, all these opportunities all tie into a project, and there are expectations around that from our First Nations.
Yeah.
And when we saw and experienced that agreement not being lived up to, I really took offense to that. It was extremely offensive because, similar to those times where there were, where there was deliberation and discussion at the treaty times, and the pipe was used to look at, to ask for guidance on where do we go with treaty. It was like a second, to me anyway. I mean, I'm sure there's many other instances like this that other leaders and people have experienced over the years and over the generations. But to me, it was like a reliving of that. Yeah. And we had come forward in good faith, and then supposed to meet, with the general contractors around involvement, and that didn't happen. The project just moved ahead. So we actually ended up in discussion with other bands in Treaty 4 and others, us in Treaty 6. We actually, essentially decided we need to just get out and send a bit of a message that, hey, like, we need to be respected and we need to be involved in a meaningful way, whether the project moves forward or not. So I guess I wanted to preface with that because my approach hasn't always been diplomatic. I shouldn't say not diplomatic. I intended for it to be diplomatic, but sometimes you got to just you got to put your money where your mouth is, and
you have to get attention.
Yeah, if I say, hey, if it doesn't go the way we've agreed, then obviously there's going to be repercussions around that, and so that was an instance of that occurring, and of course, our elders and other leaders, came from far and wide, from BC to Alberta to Treaty 4, and obviously that they had another blockade down just outside of Regina, the Treaty 4 nation. So really, it was to bring attention to that there needs to be an elevated level of respect for who we are. And fast forward into my role with the center, obviously, my role is to assist and support 74 First Nations with a diverse range of approaches and expectations around resource development, ranging from meaningful engagement to economic development, equity partnerships, resource revenue sharing, if however we'd like to term it. But all of these issues are at play on any given day within my role here at the center. So I always need to ensure that, when I'm interacting with industry or government, that there is an openness to listen. But as you had mentioned, it still needs a certain level of assertiveness in terms of our rights and who we are and the respect that we need to have as First Nations people as we enter into discussions. Yeah. And that's something that I've always tried to carry. I mean, I feel that I'm well grounded culturally and are able to articulate and bring forward those components too. And it may be just in terms of my professional training as a teacher, maybe that I do tend to try and break things down and articulate them through so people can really get a good sense of understanding, because at the end of the day, what you want to do is try and bring forward what a person really feels like. Yep. Like, why are we really here? I mean, not because of anything else, not because of a document, this and that, but this is what we're trying to accomplish, and we need to be able to come together in a meaningful way and respectively. And one thing I think I understood early on is that you can come to the table, as a chief, as was in my own case, and articulate these issues around rights and demand involvement and those types of things. But we still need to come forward with capacity if we want to be involved in projects, because at the end of the day, it's just human nature. It doesn't matter what background you're from. Projects are technical and they're dangerous when you're out in the field. And we want everybody to participate, but we want everybody to be respected and come home safe to their kids. Yeah. So that's one thing that really, that I think about in my daily life, is how I felt that, if the government or a company says, okay, the doors are open, what do you want to do? We need to ensure that we can articulate and come forward with the capacity as well as a First Nations partner.
Yeah. So just in the context of education, and you're so familiar with this is like second nature to you, but for a lot of our listeners, the concepts aren't quite as clear. You talk about treaty and inherent right. Just explain to a non-Indigenous audience what you mean by treaty and inherent right.
Yeah, well, I think the initial, I guess, overarching point that I can make is that as First Nations people, we've been here for generations and generations, time immemorial, and we have very strong ties to the lands and medicines that we utilize each and every day here. And there's not only a physical component to our utilization of our animals, our plants, our waters, those sorts of things, but there's also a spiritual connection to them, and they're integral to all of our ceremonies here. And when we look at the aspects of inherent and treaty rights, inherent rights are rights that we have, and we're born with them, and each of us are born with them, from our respective backgrounds. And then, but that's inherent rights are not to be confused with treaty rights. And I think the basic understanding of that is treaties were signed to, afford the opportunity for settlers or those that were new to our continent, to Turtle Island, to be able to share the land, with us. So I think the point to drive home is that we had rights already prior to us signing treaties, and we refer to those rights that we've had before and we continue to have as our inherent rights as First Nations people to these lands and territories. And so treaty rights we would see as those as our inherent rights being respected, and and then we move on even further to the Canadian Constitution around treaty rights, Aboriginal and treaty rights being hereby recognized and affirmed. So that the Constitution as well didn't give us rights. It essentially affirmed that these rights were already there prior to settlement and prior to contact. So that is an important component that people, we want people to understand and be up to speed and be educated on.
That's a very important description, and I really appreciate your careful characterization of what's going on. But let me ask you the question, sort of a bit of a not as easy question, I guess. When I attend and when you attend First Nations gatherings, you know that people talk about treaty all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They internalize the treaty. They know that they actually have read it. When you deal with non-Aboriginal people, my guess is you don't see that very often. We've made a bit of a step because you now get these land statements before almost every meeting. You know, we're here on the land of Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 First Nation. We're here on the land of the homeland of the Métis. And I always wonder if the people who say those things understand the significance of them. But what role do you play, and how important is the issue of actually educating non-Aboriginal people about treaty rights and Aboriginal rights? That must be a big part of what you have to do.
Yeah, that's essentially, something that I feel comfortable doing, and I think, it's important as well to, not only focus on the aspects of inherent in treaty rights, but also to ensure that we're articulating the difference amongst who we are as First Nations. I mean, a lot of times, we get, categorized into one group, as First Nations people or a treaty area. And, there's a lot of different understandings and sharings around, even treaties themselves was an exercise in terms of divide and conquer mentality of the crown and government of the day. So you can start to see, as you move from, settlement to treaties to reserves, to tribal councils, all these types of, developments that have happened over time that have really led to, the groups getting smaller and smaller. So the education piece for me is very important. We do undertake at times cultural awareness sessions that we've offered here out of the center. But I think, for me personally, I feel it. You hear both sides of the coin. Is it our responsibility to be teaching about treaties and these sorts of things? But if we don't, I think we're all aware of who writes the history is right in the history.
Yeah.
So I think it's and I've mentioned this in the past that it's who develops a narrative that and out to the public that gets the traction. So I think for us it's important for us to be at our ceremonies to learn and be around our elders to learn, but also to be able to be in the boardrooms to educate. And I think it's becoming more well received, but it hasn't come without its difficulties. Whether it's our blockades on the pipeline or Idle No More or Black Lives Matter. It takes it oftentimes takes those types of those types of scenarios to create awareness, and hopefully from that awareness, that moves towards a welcoming of understanding with these areas. So I do think it's important that we do assume a lot of that responsibility, because we want our stories to be shared in the right way. And then I'm a Cree person, that's I'm a Nahil from Rick Pheasant, but also there's Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, there's Soto, there's Dene, there's a different tribal backgrounds within a First Nations context.
Yeah.
And we all have different languages, we all have different ceremonies. There are similarities, but there are a lot of there's a lot of uniqueness to who we are as a tribal nation, if you will.
That's really important. So tell me a little bit more about the Saskatchewan First Nations Natural Resource Center of Excellence.
Yeah.
I've actually seen you in action, and I've seen the impact you've had on different organizations, but most people don't know about the center itself and the work that you do.
Yeah, great. Well, our primary mandate is to assist and support, again, our 74 First Nations from across this province of Saskatchewan in relation to, what we like to focus on is the responsible development of our resources. And I mean that comes with a lot of undertones and a lot of implications, if you will, in regards to our mandate and what we do here. And we participate and support our First Nations, right across the spectrum from early engagement to aspects of duty to consult. We've participated in undertaking environmental assessments. When the Husky Oil Spill occurred here, a few years back, we actually undertook an independent environmental assessment along the North Saskatchewan River, really from the point of the spill site to out to Cumberland House. So our I guess our real mandate in real time is to be there on hand to support our First Nations in whatever capacity that they need. And my specific role is to ensure that we're bringing forward that required expertise that they need to support not only the leadership but the elders and members of their community, so that they're able to understand understand things. Obviously, industry, whether it's oil and gas, potash, or uranium, things get pretty technical, and our people don't deal with technical aspects, if you will, by and large, day to day. So really, we come in and help that along, help ensure that they understand and feel comfortable in speaking their mind. I think that's been one big thing. I mean, we've attended a lot of sessions in communities where there's a proponent, they're looking at building a project, they're in engagement sessions, and so we're on hand to at times even translate as a translator, and then work through our own we bring them along in mapping exercises, so it's a comfortable environment for them to share information. And at times I'm expected to lead a conversation, and at times I'm there and we're there just to take notes and help along the band in those ways. So obviously, at the end of the day, our goal is to ensure that we're working to build capacity for every First Nation across this province.
Yeah. I was really impressed with the role that you played and other First Nations played in the Husky Oil Spill. Can you describe the situation to us and sort of the way that First Nations worked with Husky Oil in that particular instance?
Yeah, definitely. So we became involved, fairly early on as the notifications came out that there was a spill along the river. There was a meeting that was called, between Husky and the FSIN and the First Nations that were impacted. And of course, I was asked to attend the meeting, and really what transpired from there was a direction saying, I think it was a Thursday, and the direction was, Sheldon, we'll need you over at the Husky at Incident Command on Saturday. And I think, I want to make that important point, because I think it's extremely important as we move forward in developing legislation and regulations that our involvement as First Nations people, to the degree that we'd like in our respective jurisdictions, to be fully involved. And whether it's the right term or not, a term that I've been sharing is integrated participation. I mean, we need to be at every table, in every conversation. I mean, we need to be involved. And as I mentioned, obviously at the leisure and approach that each First Nation would like to be involved. But as we moved into a situation of an oil spill that massive along the North Saskatchewan River, the concerns were very great. And when I had attended, myself along with another fella member from BATC, as we had mobilized and moved to the Husky building in Lloydminster, it was full-on incident, unified command, incident response. Everybody was everywhere. So we didn't essentially have a place to land or be involved in black and white. So I think for Husky and the levels of government, it was an exercise too, where they didn't really know how do we include our Indigenous groups, or how do we include Sheldon in our conversation. So we had to just learn on the fly, and I think that we need to be more more structured, so that we understand as First Nations on where our input is going to be in an incident like that, because everything's happening so quick. There's a lot of government agencies that are in play. There's Husky, there's people in the field, all of these types of things. So that emergency response piece, there needs to be a lot of continued development on that piece for our meaningful participation. So in relation to that Husky spill, that was my early involvement, and of course there were 22 First Nations that were impacted in one way or another, all the way down to Cumberland House, and of course concerns into Alberta. But we had so from my involvement, my early involvement there, there obviously hasn't been a long-standing trust with industry in general in First Nations, or the government with First Nations in respect to resource development projects. And this, of course, stems from the aspects of engagement and duty to consult. So this situation wasn't unlike any other. So as we became more involved, and I became a little bit more knowledgeable about what was going on, but not really in the rooms, right? Like we were in rooms, but I don't know if we were in the right rooms. So this leads to this, kind of along this continuum of developing trust. And so we negotiated and undertook an independent environmental assessment of the spill. We focused a lot on the sediment along the river. So I've walked many miles along that river, and for a couple of years, as well as many others. But essentially what we've done is we worked with the communities. Of course, we had some folks support us in that work. Respect is the name of the group that had helped us along. So we developed a full-on independent assessment that we were able to share and provide our First Nation, so that they could see from a trusted entity that they have as the center, giving them information that they could, that we're able to explain, and they can bring forward with any supports or any issues. So obviously it's moved along a continuation, and I know some of the, there are some cases that are, still currently underway in the courts around that spill, as it relates to our First Nation.
I just have to give you utmost respect for how you handled that, and the way in which you played a personal role, but also the way the center played a role in sort of mediating between Husky Oil and the First Nations, and calming things down, and making sure that First Nations rights were respected. As you say, these are ongoing processes. But I remember at the time when it happened, this did not stay in the headlines as a daily crisis. It managed to give the impression that the First Nations and the oil company were more or less by themselves working things out to everybody's mutual benefit. And rather than it being sort of a point for huge confrontation, it became one for problem solving. Yeah. So Sheldon, this is great. I'm going to ask you one last question that I think brings all these pieces together.
You bet.
You described the phrase you used it several times in our conversation about meaningful participation. Mm-hmm. So I want you to explain that concept, because I think it's really central to understanding Indigenous involvement in the natural resource sector. But I also want you to sort of explain the concept and then tell me where you hope things will be 20 years from now. When in terms of Indigenous involvement in oil and gas, but also natural resources generally, where will it be 20 years from now?
Well, I think overall, I think that's, the forefront of everyone's mind is what type of environmental footprint will natural resource development have, on our respective areas. I think that's the starting point in everyone's mind, when we're looking at the future. And this aspect of meaningful participation is it's, I won't say it's a difficult subject, but it's a subject that needs to ensure that it welcomes and understands a variety of points of view. Being from our First Nations leadership to our elders to community members, because chiefs deal with a variety of approaches to resource development, or not being in favor of resource development within our community. So when a project is proposed in a certain area, leadership, chief and councils have to weigh out the pros and the cons with respect to their community. And that's not necessarily only talking about inherent in treaty rights as it relates to duty to consult and constitution along the provincial regulatory or federal regulatory perspective. We got to look at it from, what does that mean to our people? What does an inherent right mean to an individual on a reserve that doesn't support resource development? And how do we look at creating dialogue and having that conversation around that? So when you look at meaningful participation, I think that we have to, and I know it's being done, a lot more now than it has in the past, but involvement in along the life cycle of the project, and prior to any project being proposed, when you're starting to get some ideas, do reach out early. That's probably the great misstep that occurs is, a company will have an idea and submit the proposal, and then as soon as it's flagged that there's a duty to consult, then they go and meet with the band. But then to us, it's already, well, you're only here because you have to, because of regulation. Just to go along with that, I mean, I think it's important to understand that, when duty to consult policies or frameworks are developed and adopted by the levels of government, whether it's the province or whether it's the federal government, that those need to be agreed to by our First Nations. In the case in Saskatchewan, I know there's great difficulty that comes forward on most projects is that duty to consult policy framework. And the reason behind that was because we weren't involved in the development of it to the level that we needed to be. So now you have a proponent's guide that's been developed from that's been a precipitate of the policy framework. And there's a misconception, in a lot of my conversations, that this is the way to go. So when that duty to consult policy framework was developed and approved and released in 2010, there's a resolution from the FSIN, the Set Chiefs in Assembly, that refutes the policy. Okay. So how do you move forward as a regulator or as a provincial government in developing, moving forward with the policy, developing a proponent's guide, and really, it's an element of misconception in terms of what industry sees as the right way to do things. So I think in terms of meaningful participation, it does need to start. It doesn't rest only with the proponent, but it directly rests with the Crown, and really that all comes back to your inherent treaty rights. The natural resource transfer agreement is definitely a big issue that continues as well, and it all relates to that engagement consultation piece. I will say, again, that it's been impressed upon us right across Indian country that we didn't cede or surrender our rights to resources. And we signed treaties prior to any provinces being established. And then in 1930, lo and behold, Canada basically provides authority over resource development to the provinces, which we were not consulted on, and we don't agree with.
Yep.
In saying that, obviously today is today, in real time is real time. So we're continuing our work as First Nations to approach these things, and they're difficult. So it gets complex, as when we ask our elders to move from their understandings around lands, resources, inherent rights, and treaty and ceremonies into a worldview of a regulator. It's a very difficult transition to make, and we want to protect them. We don't really like to have them come into that space and tell their stories and pour their hearts out, because it's difficult for them, because their teachings are even closer to to things than we are. As a younger generation, where obviously things get lost a bit over time, and but I think that we are on a spectrum where we understand that we're moving towards ensuring that as a younger generation we're learning more and more.
Well, Sheldon, this has been extremely helpful and extremely important. I always sort of reflect on the role of Indigenous people in the natural resource economy. The historian in me sort of says, let's remember where we were 30 or 40 years ago, where there was no national First Nations Natural Resource Center of Excellence. There was no Sheldon Wuttunee doing the kind of work that you're doing. There was no duty to consult and accommodate. But you've done a wonderful job of explaining two things. That one of them is the role that Indigenous people play now, 2020, in the natural resource economy. But in your typical sort of gentle way, you also made it really clear there's a lot of unresolved issues.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of things still to do. And we should always look at things that way. That's not a criticism of anybody. The world unfolds slowly. We discover things as we go along. I worry often that First Nations, carry the burden for the slow resolution of issues, that they live in poverty while the non-Indigenous populations lives with prosperity. And so delays work to the benefit of one group and not to the other. But I really appreciate your observations and your comments. You have any final thoughts?
I think one final thought is to just ensure, along the lines of your comments, Ken, I think it's important that we create an area or space for openness and welcoming. What I've learned over the years is that, as we move forward and continue to be involved in resource development projects, we rely heavily on the companies for knowledge into what they're doing. Reciprocally, companies rely on us and our elders for knowledge as well, as it relates to stewardship of lands, waters, animals, and our medicines. And it's important to keep that at the forefront, that the sharing is going to be very important. And we have a spiritual connection to our lands and our plants and our animals and our medicines. They're integral to our ceremonies. So there's staple items within our ceremonies that we need to ensure that we have. They're wild game, berries, these types of things. They're staple items, just like if you will, wine and communion when you're in the church. That's how staple they are.
Yep.
So when you're going to do a development project, think of it in that way. Are you going to go destroy the wine and communion in a mass? But I just wanted to speak a little bit to that, because that's how we look at things from our end when projects are looking at moving into our territories.
And I really love that very much, actually, Sheldon, because on the one hand, it's showing a path toward reconciliation and sort of accommodation by saying, here's who we are, so understand this. But also at the other level, it just emphasizes the point that Indigenous people's experience of the world and their way of understanding and living with the world is quite different from the non-Indigenous population. And the natural resource sector sort of brings that to a fore, doesn't it? You see the utilitarian approach of the non-Indigenous population sort of in contrast to the spiritual approach of First Nations.
Yeah.
So, Sheldon, this has been just wonderful. Sheldon Wuttunee is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Saskatchewan First Nations Natural Resource Centre of Excellence, a very prominent leader in Saskatchewan and Western Canada in the whole field of natural resource development, Indigenous empowerment, and the oil and gas sector. Sheldon, thank you very much for being with us today.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ken. And, certainly wish everybody a good journey in days to come.